And welcome back to 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers and F-Series, America's best-selling truck for 48 years and the official truck of the Boston Red Sox. He's Peter Abraham of the Boston Globe. I am Alex Speier, also of the Boston Globe. We know each other. Pete, good to see you. How's everything?
Alex, how are you doing?
I'm great. Well, I'm looking forward to some days of chaos, right? Where we're kind of in that countdown stretch. This is the craziest time of year in baseball, right? Like you have, on the one hand, you have the Hall of Fame ceremonies taking place in Cooperstown. The fact that that occurs against the backdrop of the trade deadline is a weird thing to me. I'm not sure exactly how those two things got paired, but nonetheless, here we are. And so there's this kind of crucible of baseball that can really have a huge effect on swaying things one way or the other, as well as stepping back entirely from the present day and thinking about kind of eternal players. Let's start with the here and now. The Red Sox have gone 2-4 out of the All-Star break. They still are in possession of the third wild card spot. Alex Cora pushed back vehemently against the idea that this is another post All-Star break a spiral or downward trend. He thinks that the team is still pitching well, still playing well. Obviously, that was a wild and impressive win in Philadelphia. Pete, what do you see from the Red Sox in those first two series?
Yeah, well, you have to take the opposition into account, right? They were on the road against two very good teams, two playoff teams. I think that has a lot to do with it. And they didn't have a good road trip if you look at the record, but I think they played better than what the record probably indicated. They showed some grit in that last game in Philadelphia, the way they won that game. And nobody in baseball seems to want to run away with a playoff spot. Certainly none of the wild card teams. I think, you're probably talking about 16, if not more teams that are within a couple games of at least a wild card spot. And as the trade deadline approaches, trying to come up with teams that are clearly identified as sellers is difficult to do because there are so many teams that still feel like they have a chance.
Yeah, I think the context that you're adding is totally fair. The Red Sox, the Red Sox played tough against the Cubs and against the Phillies. Obviously, there was an extra innings lost in that first game that was so weird with the catcher's interference to end that game, followed by another catcher's interference of a very different form in the loss in game two, followed by that was a real rabbit from a hat victory to erase a 5-0 deficit and end up in this weird shootout, extra innings victory on the road finally, right? They had been 0-7 in road extra innings games up till that point. But it's, the thing that Alex Cora hung his hat on is the pitching, and that being the differentiator from when, for instance, the Red Sox lost a series in Colorado in their second series after the All-Star break last year. Where do you see the pitching being right now? What is your level of confidence in terms of the Red Sox ability to? They obviously had a great finish, from basically the beginning of June until the All-Star break in terms of the performance of both the rotation and the bullpen. Do you think that is a sustainable performance collectively?
Well, I think to some degree it is, but I also think that they need to go out and obtain a starting pitcher if they're serious about this, because I don't know how long you can keep going on and assuming you're going to continue to get that same level of performance from the starters that they have now. Richard Fitz, I think showed in Philadelphia that, he might not be ready for this point of the season and the demands that are on starting pitchers. And, Giolito's pitched a lot better. Buehler's pitched a lot better. But I think those guys would be a lot better for a playoff team if they were a step further back in the rotation. You had somebody behind Garrett Crochet or Brian Bayo, whether it's a number 2 starter or number 3 starter, and you pushed everybody else back a bit. That's a much better rotation. Now, identifying who that may be is proving problematic because, as we said, it's not really become clear so much of the trade deadline about what starting pitchers could move or when they will move or if they will move. But to me, beyond anything that they would do to help their lineup, they need to go out and get a competent starting pitcher, not a number 4 or number 5, somebody who would be higher in the rotation.
Well, as you point that out, I think that that's kind of where they were targeting their sights. But I do think that there's been some adjustment of that because of the season-ending loss of Hunter Dobbins, who's throwing really well. Like that was unfortunately timed, obviously for both him and the Red Sox. And then also, there is Fitz, as much as he showed immense promise in spring training. I don't think that we should be discounting the fact that that's a major injury when you have a pectoral strain, right? Like that's getting to the heart of what's moving when you're throwing a baseball, and so you aren't exactly sure what's going to be happening on the other side of that. And what's been happening on the other side of that is a lot of home runs. And as we know, the postseason is a game that oftentimes is won and lost based on power, on the ability to keep the ball in the park and or to drive it out of the park. And so you really don't want a guy who's home run prone as kind of this anchor against the best teams in baseball. And I do think that the Red Sox, Bayo comes with the benefit of being a terrific ground ball pitcher, right? That typically limits some of the extent of the damage. Garrett Crochet has been fantastic about limiting home runs this year, keeping the ball in the park, striking out he does everything you want someone to do, right? So you feel pretty good about those two guys. Giolito, I think that we've seen in the last couple of outings that attack of the elevated fastball, right, followed by along with the vertical game of fastball and changeup / slider at the bottom of the zone. If you're missing your spot, if you're a little bit imprecise with it, the way that the fastball moves, it's gonna go in the air, and sometimes it's gonna go really far. That was he was very accountable after his poor start in Philadelphia. But I think that I do wonder whether or not at this point, I feel like they just need to have a deeper rotation, in any form, right? Like given the Dobbins injury, where I think, if they don't get a number 5, then it's kind of, then they're not doing what they should be doing at the deadline. Who do you see as being in that kind of higher tier, of pitchers when you talk about wanting to push down the Giolito and Buehler's and maybe get kind of a number 3-ish guy?
I mean, somebody like Merrill Kelly would make a lot of sense, I think. And Arizona seems to be in sell mode now. So, I think it's trying to line up with teams like that and find somebody. I don't know that they're going to go out and, I don't even know that there is necessarily an ace out there to go out and get. I think even some of the guys with good reputations have had flawed seasons. But somebody like a Kelly could come in, playoff tested pitcher, and I think give them an immediate lift. And no, he's not a top of the rotation kind of guy necessarily, but he's certainly somebody. If you were going into a series or starting a playoff series, and it was Crochet and Bayo, and then somebody like Kelly, I think you'd feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I think that it's worth taking a step back and noting that there's always a roll of the dice here, right? Like the fact that Merrill Kelly is viewed as being like a proven postseason starter is itself kind of strange, right? Like who would have thought that was going to be the case in 2023? It's certainly possible that a Walker Buehler could end up being a very good playoff starter, right? Like as Buehler himself noted after this most recent start in Philadelphia, he was like, I'm taking steps in the right direction. I'm not exactly doing victory laps. I don't see myself by any stretch of the imagination as being back and being the guy. But what I do know is that like for all of this conversation about like the Red Sox needing to acquire someone else to round out the playoff rotation, like he said, like, that's supposed to be me. And he recognizes that he has work to do to get there. But I think that when you're the Red Sox, if you are thinking about the playoffs, which you should be, right? You're holding on to a wild card spot right now. And as you point out, it is a very flat landscape. There's not a lot. There aren't giant obstacles that you're trying to steer around in order to think about how you're going to make it into the postseason. Like you have a path if you play well, if you're a good team. They believe they're a good team. So if you're the Red Sox, you just want to give yourself you want to play the odds, and the odds are the more competent starting pitching you have, the better a chance you have of getting someone who's going to be able to competently navigate October. But would you define the starting pitching market as the top tier of the Red Sox needs right now, or do you think, or has it shifted for you?
Well, I think it does need to be a starting pitcher at least. Offensively, I don't, you'd like to see him get somebody who could play first base. I don't know that it needs to be an everyday first baseman, but somebody else who could play first base. Abraham Toro, who gave them a big lift when he was initially put into the lineup, has had a tough July and even going back to June. So you'd like to see him. Maybe they could boost the lineup in that way. They certainly don't need outfielders. They certainly, they're every day somebody who probably should be playing is sitting. So they could boost the offense that way. I think like any other team that has playoff aspirations, they'll try to add or probably will add some sort of relief pitcher. Hopefully, somebody who could get big outs in the 7th and 8th inning when you're leading. But to me, everything starts with the rotation. They need to do something to help the rotation, if only to, I think to send the message to the rest of the team that we're serious about this. It's not just going to be additions who won't be with the team next year like they did last year. Guys who you knew after a week or so that these guys aren't going to be any help. This didn't make a difference. It needs to be somebody that when that guy comes into the clubhouse, everybody else feels pretty good about having that guy in their rotation for the rest of the season. So identifying who that is, somehow, even with July 31st approaching, we're not quite there yet. But I do think that Craig Breslow is going to feel the need to do that. And I think a lot of that's going to come from ownership. And talking to different people over the last few days, I've been told that in the Red Sox, the top guys in the Red Sox organization feel that making the playoffs this year is extremely important. They don't want to make this a 4-year drought and one berth in the last 7 years, and that they're going to push Craig Breslow to make some serious additions to this team. And that, they've been promising the fans for a couple of years now that we're a playoff team. This is the year we're going to win. If they don't deliver on that, I think at some point, you just start looking at the track record and say, well, the Red Sox aren't a very good team. They don't make the playoffs. They've only done it once in the last 7 years. That's a tough thing to overcome with a fan base, especially, in a place like Boston with the what they charge for tickets, how expensive it is to spend a day at Fenway Park. You can't keep selling hope. At some point, you have to put your team in the playoffs.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because I was surprised for that reason that the team hadn't been more aggressively involved on Josh Naylor before he ended up going to the Mariners. For a pair of pitching prospects who rank in their kind of 11 through 20 in the Mariners farm system, I thought that was a guy who would have really benefited the Red Sox, and I think that rentals are fine. Like, teams feel great about rentals a lot of the time, and I think that would have been a guy who would have come across as a difference maker, someone who both has a great reputation in terms of his intensity and kind of that competitive fire that he brings, but also he's just a really good hitter. And I do think that there's an awful lot of uncertainty related to different parts of the Red Sox lineup. They're young, I think that you have guys who are coming back from injury in the form of Bregman and in Masataka Yoshida. You have reason to believe that, especially Bregman is going to be pretty good based on what he did coming back from the quad injury in 2021. But it takes time to get there. And he still certainly looks like he's, physically working through timing in a way that you would expect. Yoshida, we're still seeing a bunch of ground balls going around to different parts of the infield. He's making contact. It's not really impactful contact. We're seeing Roman Anthony and Marcelo Meyer having to adjust to what it looks like when really good teams, really good pitching staffs game plan against them. Roman Anthony, I don't think he's going to be punching out 4 times every game, but he certainly had a rough go of it in Philadelphia. And I think that there's not that baseline at the major league level that tells you what it's going to be. So I was, for that reason, I was a little bit surprised. From my understanding is that the Red Sox more were in the due diligence mode on Josh Naylor than they were aggressively pushing for him, even though they have a kind of depth of pitchers where it wouldn't, I believe that they could have put together a comparable package to what the Mariners were able to put together. So I guess I'm a bit surprised that they didn't, but I do think that your point is very interesting, right? Like, this is not just a team trying to make the playoffs right now. This is a team trying to make the playoffs for the first time since 2021. And there's a difference between those two things.
I think so. I mean, to me, every year when the season starts, you go to spring training and we hear from Sam Kennedy about how playoff driven they are and they're determined to deliver for the fans. And every year it proves to be empty promises. And the Red Sox have, for the last couple of years, have literally been a 500 team. And how many sellouts have there been at Fenway Park, this year? Not very many. And the idea that it's a difficult park to get into isn't true anymore. How many times over the last few years have we seen, especially for weekend series against certain teams, as many, if not more, fans from the other team than there are Red Sox fans? The Red Sox seem to have a different, promotion of some sort to get people into the park every night, to try to get a couple hundred extra more people into the park. It used to just be, come see the Red Sox. We're a great team. They didn't need to do that sort of thing. So I do think that it's going to be interesting to see. Craig Breslow, to me, has been cautious at times with his moves, and obviously the Red Sox have built up their farm system to a great degree over the last few years, something that started with Chaim Bloom. But you need to make that work for you in other ways. Those prospects are not just there to become future Red Sox. Some of them are there to be used as trade chips. So these next few days, I think, are going to be very interesting, one way or another, to see what the Red Sox look like come August 1st. If they've done things where you say, I feel pretty good about this team, or if you're just saying, well, they could have done a lot more than what they did.
Well, we will continue our discussions about what's going to happen between now and the trade deadline, and we'll also step back and take stock of things happening in Cooperstown and maybe not happening in Cooperstown over the coming weekend. But Pete Abraham and I will be back right after these messages. We'll be back to 310 to Left, presented by your New England Ford dealers.
310 to Left is presented by your New England Ford dealers, who've been taking everyone out to the ball game at Fenway Park for decades. Catch Ford next time you're at Fenway, including in the Ford Clubhouse, a full-service bar perfect for bringing your lineup together and for recording our live edition of 310 to Left. It's all brought to you by your New England Ford dealers and F-Series, America's best-selling trucks for 48 years and the official truck of the Boston Red Sox.
Back on 310 to Left, presented by your New England Ford dealers with Peter Abraham. Pete, we were talking about the Red Sox outlook in advance of the trade deadline, and your sense that there's an organizational urgency in some respects, particularly at the ownership level, to really push in on this year. That said, there's only so much you can do, right, based on supply, and I think that. I think that as much as Joe Ryan has been kind of this focal idea, this kind of idealistic scenario for the Red Sox, to me, I don't expect a guy like Joe Ryan, a controllable front of the rotation starter, to move before this year's deadline. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I just feel like those guys, a team wants to wait for when they have a starter like that for multiple years of control, and when they have competitive ambitions for the following season. They really want to take their time to think about whether or not they can put themselves in better position to contend in the near-ish future by taking a full offseason to digest all of the proposals rather than doing so against the deadline. I don't know if you feel similarly or differently, or like kind of whether or not you think that the starting pitching market is going to be defined by rentals, or whether you think there is going to be kind of a front of the rotation guy who's controllable who ends up popping onto the market.
Yeah, I think if you look at somebody like Derek Falvey with the Twins, like what an interesting position he's in. The team is up for sale. He's running both the business and baseball sides of the operation for them. He's got this piece in Joe Ryan that you could theoretically get a lot for, but the Twins, how much would he be thinking to himself? I'd like to continue to take a run at this. I'd like to keep this team together. Maybe we're not that far off. Yeah, there's a lot to sit down and look at the 30 teams and come up with a team that would be clearly ready to trade a very good starting pitcher. It's a short list of guys, Alex. To me, that's the biggest thing. I think every fan of team, whatever fan you are, Red Sox, Yankees, Mets, Dodgers, you think, well, my team should just go out and get what we need. It's not like going to the grocery store. There's only so many places. There's only so many teams that are going to be willing to trade players. And if 6 teams are knocking on their door for that guy, yeah, that's good if you're the seller. But I don't think that every buyer is going to get what they need. There's going to be teams come July 31st that are going to be disappointed that they weren't able to do what they wanted to do.
So, we had talked about Josh Naylor not having been the Red Sox not necessarily having been very in the mix on Josh Naylor. Do you see them going after a guy like a Ryan O'Hearn? Do you see other options available on the first base market?
Yeah, you know, first base is funny, right, Alex? Because you might have somebody who's maybe not an everyday first baseman, has played first base at some point in his career, and you say, okay, that's a guy we could work into our mix with what we have already on the team, or you could go out and get a guy who just plays first base like O'Hearn. There's I think a lot of ways that you could approach first base, you know, without it necessarily being a guy who's an everyday established first baseman. So, you know, do the Red Sox want somebody who's going to be their everyday guy? Do they want somebody who's going to platoon with Romy Gonzalez? You know, there's a lot of different ways that they could approach that. So I'll be interested to see what they do. I mean, you could make upgrades at other places, but to me, first base seems like the obvious choice. And that is, you know, unless you're looking at like a wider shakeup where you're trading some of your major league players to obtain the pitcher that you want. But if it's just, you know, filling a hole in the offense, it would be to go out and get a first baseman.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me for first base is that you have some complexity about the question of like, okay, so there's the rental possibility of a Ryan O'Hearn. There's also maybe you can make a run at someone like Tyler Soderstrom, who's with the A's, who probably is best suited to be a first baseman. He's been in the outfield right now because they kind of have a surplus of the first base corner outfield DH guys with Brent Rooker and Nick Kurtz. But do you acquire a guy who has multiple years of control for first base? How does Tristan Casas weigh into that pursuit? Or how does Christian Campbell weigh into that? Because, you know, if you're thinking about an everyday position for Campbell moving forward, at least on the 2026 team, first base might be the most obvious path, depending upon as long as Alex Bregman is back, right? Which is another ball of wax. Yeah. But there's some complexity to the question of whether or not the Red Sox would pursue, to me, a controllable first baseman.
Well, I found it interesting that since he's been sent down to AAA, Christian Campbell's played more first base than any other position. Yeah, I figured he would be playing some first base, but the fact that he's played more first base than anywhere else was a little bit surprising to me. And the Casas situation is to me a very, very interesting one. He's not, you know, he's a guy in his 20s who not that long ago they looked at as a centerpiece of the team. Now he has since had 2 major injuries. What do you do with him? Do you just bring him to camp next year and hope that he's healthy and give him a chance to earn a job? Can you bank on the idea that he can still play, you know, be an everyday first baseman? Do you bring him to camp but have somebody else that you feel better about at first base and let's just see what Tristan can do? Maybe he becomes a DH. Maybe he does something else. I don't know that there's an answer for him. Those 2 injuries are very significant injuries, and I don't. It'll be interesting to see how they treat him. I mean, you're not just going to release him, but I mean, what do you do with a guy like that? I don't know. That's, you know, the thing with his chest. You know, when he tore the rib cartilage, he took a big swing and tore rib cartilage. Is that something that could happen again? The knee injury. I mean, he's not a speed guy by any means, but that's a very significant knee injury in terms of his mobility. You know, you'd like to think he'll come back, he'll be fine. He's a young guy. But I don't know. The first base is an interesting question because you don't know. You certainly can't, at this point in the calendar, have any idea what you have with Tristan Casas.
We're going to be talking a little bit more about the trade deadline at the bottom of the hour when Buster Olney joins us. But right now, I did want to divert a little bit to the idea of Cooperstown. And this is obviously a wonderful weekend. It's incredible. Like the dynamic around the Hall of Fame on induction weekend is truly special. Ichiro going in is going to make it a very international event. Cooperstown, the Hall of Fame, has a special Yakyu exhibition on the history of Japanese baseball, which is super cool. But you wrote a great piece in the Boston Globe about Dwight Evans and the question of whether or not he is worthy of the Hall of Fame and whether or not there's a realistic path for him to be in the Hall of Fame. He is, as he's considered potentially by the Veterans Committee. What are your thoughts on those 2 things? Like, tell me about like the Hall of Fame case for Dwight Evans and the Hall of Fame likelihood for Dwight Evans.
Yeah, well, the path is there. In the next few weeks, the Hall of Fame is going to be putting together candidates and vetting them to be on the ballot in December at the winter meetings for what they call the contemporary baseball era, which covers Dwight's career. And This process will go through the summer and the fall. They won't announce who's on the ballot until right before they vote. They don't want the voters to be lobbied in any way if they can help it. So it's a process that takes some time, but it's all behind the scenes. So over the next few weeks, Dwight's name is clearly going to be bandied about as somebody who could be on that ballot, which is why we timed the story to run when it did, because what would be the point of running it after they've already decided who was going to be on that ballot? And I didn't want to write something just, from an emotional standpoint of this is one of the best players in Red Sox history. Everybody loves Dwight Evans. He should be on the Hall of Fame ballot. I tried to take myself out of that and just look at it. What did he do in his career when compared to the other guys that he played against? I think as a Hall of Fame voter, it's difficult to when you evaluate players, I think you have to look at them in the context of the time when they played. It wouldn't make sense to compare Dwight Evans to, Ralph Kiner or somebody else, a right fielder from 50 years ago. You have to look at what he did against the guys that he played against in his time, because the game changes over eras. It's a different game now than it was 40 years ago. It'll be a different game 40 years from now. And when and Theo Epstein kind of proved to be a good guide in this, and he brought up the point, Evans roughly hit 270 with a 370 on-base percentage and a 470 slugging percentage. If you look at how many guys did that over 10,000 plus plate appearances, it's a very small list of players. And all of those guys, for the most part, other than the guys who have been connected to performance-enhancing drugs, are in the Hall of Fame or eventually will be in the Hall of Fame. Somebody like Albert Pujols. And Dwight Evans is part of that group. If you look at the players who did that during the time that he played, it's an even smaller group. If you look at, the players in the Red Sox are one of the prominent franchises in baseball history. If you look at where he stands among their leaders in different offensive categories, the players before him and after him are pretty much all Hall of Famers. If you look at his performance in two of the greatest World Series that the game has ever had, 1975 and 1986, Dwight Evans was one of the best players on the field. And Peter Gammons told me a story that when he spoke to Sparky Anderson during that World Series, they were warming up for a game. He pointed to Dwight Evans and said, "That's the best guy on the field." And Sparky Anderson had a team of unbelievably great players. So I think, the point Theo made is that if Dwight Evans played now, how valuable would he be? A tremendous defender in right field, a guy with power, and a guy with a 370 on base percentage. Like how, he would be he would be one of the most valuable players in baseball, a guy with a huge contract. But that wasn't, we didn't care about on-base percentage back in the 70s and 80s. That wasn't something people paid a lot of attention to. Defense wasn't something you could really quantify back then. Imagine Dwight Evans in the era of StatCast and being able to, really know how strong his great arm was, how much ground he covered, how much better, he helped make Fred Lindby in center field because he covered so much ground in right field, how good that combination was. All of those things were what I tried to put into that story. And I think if Hall of Fame voting is an interesting thing. People say you should know it right away. I disagree with that. I think you need to do your research. I think you need to do your homework and look at a player and compare him to other players and sit down and make out that chart. And if you do, I think Dwight Evans is a Hall of Famer. And I do think that the last time he was on that ballot, he was only a few votes short. And I think there's a chance come December he could get over the top.
Well, fascinating perspective, Pete. It's a great article. I recommend that people read it on the Boston Globe website. We are going to be going to break right now, but after the break, we will have Buster Olney to take more stock, both of Dwight Evans' Hall of Fame candidacy and, of course, the trade deadline. So stick around. We'll be right back on 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers. And we are back on 310 to Left, presented by your New England Ford dealers. And our ranks have expanded. We're joined now by Buster Olney of ESPN. Buster, it's awesome to see you. Thanks so much for joining. And let's jump into it. The Dwight Evans Hall of Fame question. Pete made his elegant case. What are your thoughts about Dwight Evans' Hall of Fame candidacy?
Yeah, and I cheated just before I came on. I was looking at the numbers, right? Adjusted OPS in his career of 127, on base percentage of 370, the Gold Gloves, the arm. all the success, close to, I think it's like 1,500 runs and 1,500 RBI. Absolutely, he should be in. And look, I got a chance to cover Harold Baines. He was a great player. He's a tremendous guy. But there's no question, when he got voted into the Hall of Fame, I think some of the standards changed, because then you could start to play that game of, well, if he's in, then this player should be in. And absolutely, a Hall of Fame that has Harold Baines, Dwight Evans should be in the Hall of Fame. Harold Baines was basically a DH for most of his career. Dwight Evans was a dominant shutdown right fielder, at playing in the most difficult outfield position to play at right field in Fenway Park. So, yeah, no question for me, he's a Hall of Famer.
I will poke a hornet's nest, but I'm going to run away from it. But I think Bobby Abreu is a really interesting comparable from another era in terms of a guy who was incredible at getting on base, who also had an excellent value as by the metrics as an outfielder. Had a really interesting all-around game that didn't register him as a star during his era, and yet has built some momentum. Chase Utley, in some ways, is another comparable case as a guy who didn't have power numbers, but whose overall game is going to thrust him into a very interesting conversation. And we're seeing different paths for Abreu and Utley, but I think that you kind of put Dwight Evans into a conversation with guys like that, where there certainly it deserves more consideration than the two ballots that he got to be considered on. But that is all incredible stuff that we get to that we love to talk about at this time of year because of the Hall of Fame inductions, that we love to talk about in January as ballots are revealed. But the here and now is, of course, the trade deadline. And Buster, you saw Josh Naylor going yesterday to the Seattle Mariners. So has the starter pistol been fired? Are we at go time, or is this going to be was that a one-off and everything else is going to wait until the 30th and the 31st?
No, I think it's absolutely go time. Look, the Diamondbacks are sort of the crossroad for me of what the trade deadline might be, because they are the team that if they decide to sell, they're the buffet table that all the other teams want to feed on. Because after Josh Naylor, you have Eugenio Suarez with the Yankees involved, with this Mariners involved, with the Chicago Cubs. You've heard about other teams too maybe being involved. I have wondered about the Red Sox. Do you bring them in and put them at first base? There's a lot of teams to be interested in him. And then you have the two starting pitchers, Zach Gallen and Merrill Kelly. Now, some executives who I've spoken with believe that the Diamondbacks aren't going to do a full-on sell, that they might wind up keeping a couple of these guys. If they do, Kelly and Gallen, it might make sense for them to give them qualifying offers, because the Diamondbacks have to rebuild their starting rotation for 2026, and they're trying to compete. But either way, the fact that that the Diamondbacks traded Naylor now tells you business is going, and there are going to be a bunch of relievers moved. I think that the Orioles are going to have a number of players who are going to move. There's going to be a lot of action, and I love the fact that the Mariners have started it off, because I think this trade really demonstrates that the American League is wide open, and there are going to be a lot of executives who feel like, hey, you know what, with a couple of good moves, we could be the team that plays in the last week of October representing the American League.
Yeah, to me, it was a pretty fascinating opening for the trade deadline, because the Red Sox and Mariners at the moment of that trade were tied in the wild card standings, sitting there in those second and third spots. And you would have identified both of those teams as having offensive needs. You were just around the Red Sox in Philadelphia. I feel like there's a growing sense that they can be pursuing more first base production. So I was a little bit surprised to hear that they weren't tremendously involved in the Naylor sweepstakes. What is your sense, after being around the Red Sox for a couple of days in Philly, about what they might be looking to accomplish at the trade deadline?
The starting pitcher, they've been involved in the conversations with the San Diego Padres about Dylan Cease, as you guys know. They've had contact. I don't know how far that's gone. I don't know if they're the most motivated buyer there. But look, if you're gonna talk to the Padres about Cease, then you're also going to talk to the Kansas City Royals about Seth Lugo. You're going to talk to the Diamondbacks about Gallen and Merrill Kelly. And I think that probably for me, and you guys are around the team more than I am, that probably for me, if the Red Sox are going to have a shot to make a dent in October, getting that starting pitcher is really important. And I'm with you, Alex. I actually had folks with other teams speculating that the Red Sox would be involved with Naylor. They thought that he was a really good fit for them, even though he's a left-handed hitter. He's not a perfect fit for what they need. But given how, the other night aside, Romy Gonzalez getting a big hit, given how he struggled, I think the assumption in other front offices is they will add a first baseman. And is it kind of incredible that every year we're talking about the Red Sox needing to add a first baseman?
Yeah, well, we've heard Alex Cora talking about the succession of players in that position, certainly.
Buster, with the sort of excess of outfilders that the Red Sox have, that they could theoretically trade one of those guys in a bigger deal than just sending prospects for a first baseman. Do you think that's, would it make more sense for them to trade one of those guys now or wait until the offseason when they could get more teams maybe in the mix for a trade?
So I remember the first time that I heard Jarren Duran's name speculated upon him, my thought was just having seen the Red Sox since the Mookie Betts trade was like, man, that would be really hard politically to trade Jarren Duran in the year after, in the a couple months after they traded Rafael Devers. And when I first saw that, I'm like, would they really do that? And then after talking with people in the last 10 days, I think they might do it because that clearly would be a situation where they're dealing from a position of strength, a position of depth, and there would be a lot of interested teams because you guys know this. Like, offense among outfielders right now is probably one of the weaker spots in baseball generally. The Kansas City Royals are desperate for outfield offense. After Jurickson Profar left the Padres as a free agent after last season, the Padres would love to have someone like Jarren Duran. And the fact that he's under team control for the next 3 years brings in a wider number of teams into the conversation. Will the Red Sox, when push comes to shove, trade the guy, and you guys know this better than I do, the most recognizable player on the roster? We'll see. And it really is, this trade deadline to me also is a test. I've had this conversation with a lot of executives. We think of on the spectrum of being aggressive and not being afraid of making a deal to the general managers who are really conservative and afraid of making a mistake. Where does Craig Breslow fall on that spectrum, right? Chaim Bloom, as you guys know, he was known among other front offices as being really careful to the point of paralyzing trade conversations at time. My instinct is that Chaim would be closer to that end of the spectrum than being an aggressive guy. But we'll see. I think it's a really important trade deadline for him.
It's been an
I find it interesting.
Oh, go ahead, Pete. Sorry.
No, the Red Sox have had to sign a number of their younger guys, their homegrown guys, to extensions. They haven't done that with Duran. So you wonder, do they necessarily see Duran as being, a player that they're going to build around? They did with Rafaela, right. They have with other guys, but they haven't done that with Duran. So to me, that suggests he could be in the mix for a trade.
Yeah, and I think that makes complete sense. And look, it's not as if he was a superstar prospect who's had a seamless run through the big leagues in his first year. He's had, 2024, he was one of the 3 most dynamic players in baseball. And this year it hasn't been the same. And if you're going to trade Jarren Duran, I don't think there's any doubt that right now he's at his peak value because of the years left before free agency, because of the fact that he's not tied to a lot of money. The team that's acquiring him isn't taking on a lot of guaranteed salary. This is when he has his highest value. And if you do believe going forward that, you're set in the outfield, even if you trade him and you're comfortable with Abreu and Anthony and Rafaela, then yeah, it's something you strongly consider.
See, to me, it's fascinating because I'm not sure that he's at peak value right now because obviously he is not in the middle of a 2024 caliber season. It's been something that's been below that standard. I also think that his value has been diminished a little bit by playing in left field where he's a little bit more bottled up. I think that the best version of Jarren Duran is the one that's in center field, which isn't going to happen right now with the Red Sox because Cedar Rafaela is out there patrolling it like almost no one else except maybe Pete Crow Armstrong can in Major League Baseball. Maybe we should throw Byron Buxton out there when he's healthy as well. But Jarren Duran, to me, it's a really interesting. There are so many strange variables because it's a down year. So maybe another team is trying to capitalize and not give the Red Sox full value. Maybe the Red Sox want to play the longer game and hope he gets hot and think that in the offseason, if that happens, they'll be able to sell at a higher value point. And also, I do think that there are both jersey selling dynamics, right? The recognizability of the team. Would they be willing to move both Devers and Duran in the same year? Number 11 and number 16 were the top selling jerseys for them. Although I think they need to print some new Roman Anthony ones, and they'll do okay there. But the other part of it being the clubhouse, because Jarren Duran is within that Red Sox clubhouse. He is a very important person, and he has kind of for years they've been telling the young players coming through the system, look at the way that guy plays. That's how you're supposed to be approaching the game. And so in the middle of this kind of education of the young players that ended up contributing to the trading of Rafael Devers, would they then take the guy who they're holding up as the paragon of virtue, at least in terms of what he does on the field, and say, goodbye? It's a strange, there are some strange dynamics going on there.
So this is why I would love to be a fly on the wall or get to talk to someone in the NSA about tapping into the phone calls between Craig Breslow and Theo. Knowing Theo and his history, he's the general manager in baseball history who climbed K2 and Mount Everest with the Red Sox and the Cubs. And he was, when you really look back at it from 30,000 feet, the idea that you would trade Nomar Garciaparra in the middle of that 2004 season. You talk about guts. When we're talking about the gut spectrum and the idea that could go bad, and yet you plow ahead because you trust your instincts. And then fast forward to 2016, when baseball had entered that era where prospects are not traded for rentals. And he and Jed Hoyer decide, boy, the finishing piece would be a deal for Aroldis Chapman. And they trade Gleyber Torres, a deal you don't see very often. So Theo has run the gamut. I mean, he understands how these things are done. And I would love to hear the conversations between he and Breslow about, hey, everything you just laid out, Alex. His Duran's presence in the clubhouse, the reaction of Red Sox fans after the Devers trade, and on the other hand, the potential growth. The opportunity that exists right now in the American League. There are no great teams in the American League, right? The Tigers have been losing a bunch of late. They desperately need late inning bullpen help. The Yankees have been hemorrhaging games in the standings. I don't think anybody looks at the Blue Jays as a dynamic team. They played well of late. The Tampa Bay Rays have slid back toward 500. Who knows? They might wind up being sellers. The Houston Astros have all these injuries. So if you're the Boston Red Sox, you could be the 2023 Texas Rangers, who came from the back of the pack in the wild card and have an opportunity to win the World Series if you make the right moves. In some ways, I can't remember a deadline where it really does feel like that with the right moves, there could be a team that could vault themselves into a position to win the World Series. That's why I'd love Seattle making the deal for Josh Naylor.
Yeah, particularly as a compliment to what we know as a great top of the rotation, right? They have some guys who you'd love to see on the mound in October. And so if you're able to balance that out with a little bit more offense, then suddenly you have one of the better rounded teams in the American League pretty quickly, right? Like the pack is so tightly clustered that I think you're right that just kind of moving a little bit faster gets you past a lot of different people in the peloton.
Yeah, and look, do we think this Red Sox team is comparable to the 04 Red Sox? Absolutely not. Do we think they're comparable to the 07 Red Sox in terms of where they are? Absolutely not. But they're not measured against those teams. They're measured against the other teams in the American League. And right now, it's a wide open field. Look, I almost think that if the Diamondbacks, before they traded Josh Naylor, if you dropped Arizona into the American League, they would be one of the better teams. There's a huge gap between these two leagues right now, more than I've ever seen. And that's why I really hope that the other American League general managers will act with alacrity, where they're aggressive. You know this, the Yankees are going to be. I think Brian Cashman, the Yankees GM, under more pressure than any other executive in baseball leading up the deadline. They're going to do something. Toronto spent $500 million on Vladimir Guerrero Jr. to keep him. They're going to do something with an older rotation. They're going to add something. So if you're the Red Sox, absolutely, I feel like you got to match some of the punches that are going to be thrown here over the next week.
So in that vein, what's going to be the biggest punch thrown at this deadline, Buster? If you were to guess as to the biggest name that's going to move between now and next Thursday, who's it going to be?
Eugenio Suarez, who is, I mean, he, is already a guy who is going to wind up with his career, somewhere in the range of 500 home runs. He's having a great season this year. He actually, one of the criticisms of him during the course of his career has been his defense. He's actually taken a bit of a step forward this year. And if you are the Diamondbacks, you have the perfect storm of teams involved in the bidding, because you have a big market team like the Yankees. You have a big market team like the Chicago Cubs potentially could make a run at him. You have a highly motivated Seattle Mariners team with a loaded farm system. I think Suarez is going to go, and just knowing Brian Cashman, I know Pete knows Brian well. I think that he's going to make a big move here, because he sees the same thing we've been talking about, that the American League is generally wide open, and he has distinct needs at third base, in the rotation, in the bullpen, and they can fill at least two of those needs if they make a big blockbuster deal with the Diamondbacks. But we'll see if Seattle steps up too with all the prospects they have.
And I suppose the corollary question is, who's going to be the biggest arm to move? You've talked about rental pitchers who you see moving. Do you think that there's going to be, I just have a hard time seeing Joe Ryan being on the move. Mackenzie Gore, I don't know that I see that happening from the Nationals. Who do you think ends up being the biggest arm to move at this deadline?
Yeah, and Alex, I feel like you have already got NSA tapped into my phones, because that's exactly what I'm hearing from other GMs about the Twins and Joe Ryan, that they've set really high prices on the relievers they have, and they feel like the Twins, in the end, will wind up keeping Ryan. He's under team control. He doesn't have a big whopper deal, and if they're going to try to be relevant in 2026, he would be a big part of that. I do think Dylan Cease is going to move, based on what I'm hearing, because the Padres' strategy is that if they can trade, and you guys I think would agree with me, that the Padres, generally speaking, they demonstrated in the playoffs last year, they're not afraid of the Dodgers. They've got some really great players at the top of their roster, with Manny Machado, who loves the bright lights, Jackson Merrill, if he's right physically. The bullpen might be the best in baseball, but it's a really thin roster. It's very top heavy with money owed. They need to get younger. They need to get some assets that are team controlled going forward. So their strategy is they want to put Dylan Cease out into the marketplace, talk to, from what I understand, the 4 American League East contenders. They've had conversations with all of them. They've talked to the Mets. They've talked to the Cubs. And what they would do is they would trade Cease, potentially get some assets back, and then maybe backfill in the rotation with a deal, for someone like Charlie Morton, who could just fill the number 4, number 5 spot in a really cheaper deal with the Orioles. Dylan Cease, as you know, is headed to free agency after the year's over. I think in the end, he's going to be the highest impact guy. If, in fact, the Diamondbacks, this is not going to be a whole sell-off, maybe Zach Gallen and Merrill Kelly wind up not getting moved, and Dylan Cease being the big guy. I would say in the last 2 weeks, there's a lot more conversation about Seth Lugo. A month ago, people were telling me that this player option he has for $15 million for 2026 might be prohibitive in terms of making a deal for him. But now the feedback I'm getting is big market teams aren't going to care about that. Everyone assumes he's going to opt out of his deal because he's had 2 good seasons. He's going to make a lot of money in free agency in the fall. And so if you are, a team like the Mets, you're a team like the Yankees, you're a team like the Cubs, the Red Sox, you would just acquire him, assuming that he's going to walk away as a free agent when the year's over, like a normal rental.
Buster, you mentioned the Dodgers. Are they just going to wait for everybody to get healthy, or do you think they could do something to try to improve what they have?
Now, Peter, I did a piece on, the 8 most desperate teams in baseball to make a deal, to make deals before the deadline. And I would have never thought I would have included the Dodgers on that list at the beginning of this year. But here's the thing. Their bullpen is so beat up. They have led the majors in bullpen innings for a lot of this season. They're so beaten up that in order for them to win the World Series, I think they are going to have to add bullpen help, which is not where we thought they were going to be. And yes, you're right. they're hoping that, Tawny continues to build up innings. They're hoping that Blake Snell comes back and he has some impact, and that Yamamoto at the end of the year is good, and Glasnow is good, and then Mookie Betts gets right with how he's playing. Once you get that championship fever, and the idea of maybe being the first team since those 98 to 2000 Yankees to go back-to-back, I think the ownership is caught up in that a little bit. And so it would not surprise me if they try to make a move for a big reliever.
Well, Buster, this has been great insight. Thank you so much for joining. Buster Olney of ESPN, joining 310 to Left, brought to you by New England Ford Dealers. Buster, we will be following you with bated breath and perhaps with tinfoil hats, trying to resist phone tapping. Look forward to seeing you down the road. Thanks, Buster.
That sounds great, guys. Thanks for having me.
310 to Left is presented by your New England Ford dealers who've been taking everyone out to the ball game at Fenway Park for decades. Catch Ford next time you're at Fenway, including in the Ford Clubhouse, a full-service bar perfect for bringing your lineup together and for recording our live edition of 310 to Left. It's all brought to you by your New England Ford dealers and F-Series, America's best-selling trucks for 48 years and the official truck of the Boston Red Sox.
We are back on 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers, and wrapping it up with Pete Abraham after that great visit from Buster Olney. Pete, what's the name that you that kind of moves the needle that Buster brought up that you think that's the guy who would make a difference for the Red Sox as they try to find their way through the American League field?
Dylan Cease. Go get Dylan Cease. I think that would be terrific. If AJ Preller is a guy who wants to make moves. The Red Sox have improved their farm system. Maybe they have somebody on the major league roster who could be part of that deal. Go get a guy like Dylan Cease, and now you're talking about a playoff team.
Yeah, that would be kind of a transformative look for the Red Sox if they end up having, yet another swing and miss guy in the front of the rotation to go along with Garrett Crochet. That would definitely, you have the lefty, you would have the righty, and that would be a very different look. Certainly, that would qualify as a big move for a rental, but. We will see what form the next handful of days takes between now and Thursday's trade deadline. We'll have plenty of stuff, both on 310 to Left and in the pages of the Boston Globe to digest it all. Pete, thanks so much for joining today. Look forward to seeing you down the road and at the park.